Um, my favorite part of every podcast are these like completely unnecessary, tacked on introductions that sort of just create the illusion that you know you're at the center of your own content. Uh, so yeah, I'm gonna do that. Today's episode of Story Rich Studio is an interview with my professor, Dr. Jason Boyd, uh, who was the professor of an elective I took this semester, a crime fiction course. Uh, Prior to this course, I took a game design course, but this was in fact the first course where we played a game for school. This is the first time I ever played a game for school. So, thought it'd be interesting to talk about, why he does that and why he picked the game that he did. So, that's it. That's all the context you're getting.
Yeah, so I'm an associate professor in the Department of English at Toronto Metropolitan University, and I'm also the director for the Center for Digital Humanities. I lead an initiative called the Stories in Play Initiative, which looks at narrative in games. And this is the first time I've taught this liberal studies course called crime fiction. And because I'm really interested in trying to include games in literature courses, I decided to include one game, The Return of the Obra Dinn, in that crime fiction course.
And as the stories in play, could you explain a little as to what the goal is? Is it to get is it like an educational resource for teachers mostly? Could you explain a little?
Yeah, so it initially started out in a graduate course that I taught, just looking at broadly digital storytelling and how it could be used for scholarly purposes. But then there are two sort of specific sub-projects within that. The first one is called the Playable Stories Archive, and it was really designed as a way of providing information about games that particularly scholars in literature, teachers in literature could think about including in their courses. So we wanted to basically explain why a particular game was useful for including in literature courses. So that was the goal behind that. And then associated with that is another project called the Unarchived Podcast. And again, it's sort of looking at games that are really interesting from a storytelling point of view, but which we felt were just too either, long or too complicated to include in a literature course. So that's how that came about.
Do you have like an elevator pitch to like a type more traditional teacher who would be like skeptical of including a
Mhm.
narrative game or any kind of game in like an
Mhm.
English class? Like, what would you say to
Mhm.
them?
I would basically say that we are missing out on a huge body of work that is doing really, really interesting things when it's coming to telling stories. And by basically just rejecting games out of hand, I think we're missing out on a lot of really interesting opportunities, both to kind of encounter new forms of storytelling, but also to engage, students like yourself, and make connections between um, traditional literature and narrative-based games, right? So that would be my sort of argument, and that there's a lot of which we try to show in things like the Playable Stories Archive. We try to show there are a lot of really interesting connections between games and traditional forms of literature.
I know you were like pretty concerned about picking something that wasn't too difficult, but were you worried at all that this was kind of difficult in its own way with sort of the subtlest sort of deductions you have to make?
Yeah, yeah, that was the problem. So it was the trade-off between, a game that might be very complicated in terms of, say, the game world or the gameplay mechanisms, and one that was very intellectually challenging, right?
Right.
So I could have basically reversed it, right? I could have done a game where it kind of spoon feeds you, everything, and you just got to kind of, go through and, brute force it or sort of keep selecting different options until you get the right one. Like I was sort of thinking for a while, the
This is what I did, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I was thinking of putting on one of the Detective Grimoire games, right? Which has this sort of, kind of I know you would call it like a toolbar where you kind of select different options, right? And when you get the right sequence, it tells you you've gotten things right. So that would have been a kind of an alternate way to go, really, really focused on, making the deduction easier, but making the gameplay a bit, more complicated.
I never cheated. I never looked anything up. I did have some spoilers from your class. And yeah, it took me an incredibly long time. It took me 17 hours,
Mhm.
over
Yeah,
Dinn.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And I
I
and I didn't expect students to play through the entire thing, because I
I
thought
went and did.
I thought they would struggle because yeah, it is kind of challenging and especially with certain characters.
Were there any that you can remember off the top of your head that you found particularly difficult?
hmm Yeah, well, I did indicate in class there was that one character, the bosun's mate, Charles Minor, or Charles Miner,
Renee,
or
yeah.
whatever, who I really, had a really hard time figuring out who he was. And I suppose if I had been a bit more reflective about the various scenes in which I had seen him and what he was doing in relationship with some of the other crew members, it would have been a more a bit easier for me to do that. But he was one that I found particularly sort of challenging because I didn't pick up on some of the cues that the Return of the Obra Dinn wiki fandom wiki has, right.
Yeah. When you assign a game like this, does it ever worry you that people are just going to watch a playthrough online and not play it themselves, or do you think that's like a equally
Yeah,
valid
I,
way of doing it?
I think that's an equally valid way of doing it. Like, and I would say I would rather you watch a playthrough than not interact with the game at all, right?
Yeah.
And come to class not knowing anything about the game. So I think that's perfectly fine because I do recognize that unlike turning the pages on a book, there are a lot of students who don't have a lot of familiarity with gaming and will struggle at things that more experienced gamers would, just be able to do as a matter of course, right? And I don't want people to feel that there's a barrier to them knowing about the work if they don't have that kind of game playing ability.
Could you speak a little as to how you think Oberdin could pair with nautical literature? Because that was something you wrote a lot about in the stories and
hmm
play entry.
hmm Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to kind of put it together with some works of literature because I think um, um, there are some works of literature, like I think a couple of Herman Melville's novels, like Redburn and White Jacket, are very detailed about how a ship operates, a ship of that time operates. But a lot of other works, they just assume that their audience is more or less going to know what life and ships in it. So it's more about the story. So I think if you were teaching one of those works, it'd be really great to have the Return of the Obra Dinn because you really get the kind of feel of what it's like to be on a ship like that, right? So I think it would really help students get into these works a bit more because they would have a very kind of concrete visual idea about how these ships were actually designed and what it was like to sort of move through them, right? And then, of course, like I think the whole supernatural aspect would work really well with, say, Jules Verne's, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, right? Because there's, again, I think they assume at one point that Captain Nemo's submarine is a kind of giant squid that's attacking, these ships, but it turns out to be a submarine. So I think it could work really well, with certain types of literature, even if the connection is a bit sort of tangential.
It does feel rare when you have a world where characters are skeptical of the existence of squid monsters and the like, and then the squid monsters go and exist.
Yeah,
That was
exactly.
interesting enough.
Yeah.
Um,
It certainly makes for a very dramatic scene when
yeah,
the Kraken attacks in the Return of the Obra Dinn.
yeah. One thing I was pretty surprised to hear in a fiction course that you said uh in the lecture was that you sort of thought in Obra Dinn story is secondary. Um, and I guess you sort of just went into that. It's when you paired it with nautical fiction.
Mhm.
But yeah, could you speak about sort of what you meant by that in lecture, that like how you think the story sort of behind the mystery and the nautical facts of it?
I think what I was trying to get at there, if I'm remembering correctly, was I was uh, basically picking up on Lucas Pope's observation about
Mm,
how um, the gameplay really drove the story, like how the story was actually constructed. Like he basically seemed to go about this by saying, I want to design a game um, where the player character deduces, who all of these characters in and how they died, right? But in order to make that into a fairly long story, I have to have a whole bunch of people dying, because the whole point of the game is to solve a whole bunch of deaths, and I can only tell the story at the moment of each person's death. So, how do I construct a story that's only consisting of moments of death, right? So it's almost like sort of kind of inverting, the story first, gameplay later. It's more like, okay, I've got this idea for a game sort of mechanism, but how do I make it work? And it sort of drives and shapes how the story actually ends up being delivered to the player.
yeah. I think something else you sort of said was that like um the story does a very good job at making you interested in it, but then when you write it down on like a wiki page, when you actually write it down, it consists
Mhm.
of mermaids and krakens
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
a lot of
Mhm.
stuff that looks silly on paper.
Mhm.
Um, it's hard to put into words because I can't quite do it. But how do you think Oberdin sort of forces you to be interested in that,
Mhm.
despite, seeming
Mhm.
silly when you actually write it down?
Yeah, I think because you're like you're in the moment, right? And you're so kind of distracted by everything that's going on and what your task is, that you're not always thinking about the overarching storyline, right?
Yeah,
And I think one of the things I was trying to say to students was that, at the end of the story, you're like, oh, hmm, my only job as the player character was basically to assess the financial liabilities of the company I work for, right? It wasn't actually to, um, uh, get justice for these people or anything. It was just to basically sort of, just done my job. And so when the story ends, you're kind of like, oh. So that's all I do. I just sort of, put in my report, and then, once I find out what the actual final chapter is, I just the book on my shelf, and the story's over, right?
yeah. No, it's been mentioned how badly you can screw people over in the insurance section. You can say the
Yeah.
guy who fell under the cannon killed people with the cannon. You can really
Yeah.
screw their estate over. It's great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
Um, yeah.
so not
Um,
not the not the kind of heroic role that you usually expect the player character to be in.
No. I just wanted the ding of the deductions. I wasn't thinking about what I was going to be doing to these people's
Oh
families.
yeah, like yeah, it's that kind of, you do get that sort of, that sort of reinforcement. Like every time you do three fates, right? You get three fates right, you get kind of a bit of a sort of endorphin rush, right? Because you're like, yes,
Yeah.
and so that kind of just sustains, I think, the interest in the story, right? Wanting to kind of, solve every fate, right? Even if
Um,
the larger purpose of doing that
yeah.
is, less than exciting.
I think to that point, a lot of people under the Krakens and the Crabmen, people have been very interesting in the smaller story bites. that kind of happen away from the action.
Hmm.
And something I found interesting was kind of the occasional success of just stereotyping people
Hmm.
um, and deducing their identity that way.
Hmm.
Occasionally that works out, like with Chalamet, you just, well, it's a striped shirt, he's a Frenchman. Might get
Hmm.
that right. But
Hmm.
then occasionally it doesn't work out so well.
Hmm.
Something a lot of people ran into, and something I did and felt pretty bad about. Um, People will assume that Winston Smith, the carpenter, must be the white guy, and
Yes.
Marcus Gibbs, the carpenter's mate, must be the black guy.
Yes.
And it just takes a single scene that the game kind of switches it around on you. But I'm just
Hmm.
curious, did you ever run into that? And
Hmm.
like, what do you think the game has to say about that?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and I was wondering if that was very deliberate as a kind of a misdirection, as it were, because I think you're right. We assume, oh, like the black man is going to be the carpenter's mate and not the carpenter, right? And and it's often very easy to make those deductions because the carpentry is an actual room, right, in the ship, right? And so if you see two men working in the carpentry, you can pretty much assume that they're the carpenter, the carpenter's mate, just as when you see two men in the surgery, you can assume they're the surgeon and the surgeon's mate, right? And
Yeah,
so I think maybe that was an attempt to kind of make that a bit more challenging than it might have been. And I think it's also Lucas Pope, also, I think, in a very kind of, subtle way, sort of saying, maybe our assumptions about, different people of different, different racialized people on a ship don't follow maybe some of the rules that happen on land, right? Like I was kind of shocked when I first played the game, and the voice of the insurance investigator, insurance adjuster, was a woman's voice, right? Which I
yeah,
had kind of, and I didn't actually realize until later that it randomly can switch between a man's voice and a woman's voice
yeah.
on
It's
on
unique how that's
in different
auto-generated.
different
Yeah.
playthroughs, right? So that, again, that was a very, I think, deliberate choice, right? And maybe kind of ahistorical, or not historically accurate, but I thought that was, sort of an interesting choice to make.
When we come to overlying themes of the Obra, if they exist, do you feel like it has anything to say about greed or about stereotyping deductions? Like, do you feel like it's ultimately a big game of Clue, or do you lean to the idea that it might have something to say?
Yeah, well, I think he's making, in the same way as he did in his earlier game, Papers, Please. I think by making this a game, like what's the description that he initially used?
I don't remember.
An insurance game with minimal color or something like
Yeah,
that. Like, it's interesting that the frame is this very specific frame of an insurance investigator for the Dutch, the sort of the Dutch East Indies Company, which was a very kind of large multinational colonial enterprise. That this investigation is framed within that, and I think it's making a very subtle point about those kind of capitalist systems, and the fact that at the end of the day, for this company, all of these people on board are just questions of money, right? How much do I have to pay, for this person's death, right? And so it kind of robs the player, through the player character, of the satisfaction of being a kind of a justice warrior, right? The one who kind of, ends up sort of meting out justice. They're just there to kind of, you know, do a financial calculation, right? So it's kind of like at the end of the game, you're like, oh, that's all I did. So I think there is a kind of a larger subtle point about sort of, capitalism, and how capitalism views people as basically commodities, right? That you can fix a price to.
do you feel like there's a dissonance there in that supposed good ending has nicer music, it has a nicer note from the surgeon about how well you did, and
Hmm.
that what you actually did was, rob people in their estate. Like, do you feel
Yeah,
like there's
yeah.
a, or do you feel like do you feel like that dissonance is accounted for in the game?
Yeah, I think that seems to be the intention. That was Lucas Pope's design intention, but yeah, I think it does lead to a kind of um, dissonance in the sense that I think players often have very fixed assumptions about player character roles and like, what winning looks like. And I think this is a much more sort of ambiguous ending that doesn't sort of satisfy the normal kind of, you're great, you won, hooray kind of ending. So I think that's quite interesting. And for some players, they might think, well, that was a bit of a letdown, right?
Yeah.
But I thought it was interesting myself.
No, I loved it all the way through. Usually in your lectures, after you're done talking about a book, I can sort of see by the end of the lecture, like why this was chosen for this point in the course. I definitely got that
Mm,
last week with the final solution
mhm,
and with the Greek interpreter. Um,
mhm.
if you could sort of give one message to students as to for the Obra Dinn, like one thing they should take away from the Obra Dinn, what would you say that is?
Um, one thing that I think the one thing that I would like students to take away from the Obra Dinn in terms of a game is that, and that's why I tried to I showed that extensive clip from that one YouTube video was that you can actually design a game that does, force you to engage in, real detective skills like deduction, right? And
Yeah.
it's possible to do that, right? I think sometimes, there's so many oddities to the Return of the Obra Dinn that you kind of forget, you forget that kind of core gameplay mechanism is a really, really interesting one, right? So I would sort of say, and that would be my explanation for why I wanted to include that on the course, right? Is that this is the one point in the course where you, the student, have to be a detective, right? Instead of reading about detectives, this is the opportunity for you to be a detective, right? And just kind of test yourself about how good you are at deduction.